Hello, it's Mr. Fowles. Today we're going to talk about declaring independence from Britain. I'm going to skip the Bellwork. I'll leave it there so you can pause if you want. The answers are 1 is C and then 2 is personal. There's the notes, and if you're looking at the presentation you can print out this black page and it prints out normally. We need to review here. This goes back. If you trace it back enough to we'll take it back to the Boston Tea Party, after which we're past the Intolerable Acts, and that's in middle of 1774. And those acts put Boston under a great deal of duress. They're not allowed to have town meetings. They're not allowed to have. They can't have their own elected government. It's pretty nightmarish. And so for 1774 and the beginning of 1775, the militia is formed, which is a small kind of volunteer army. And in April of 1775, we had the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which was heralded by Paul Revere. And the colonists won that, of course. So after Battle of Lexington and Concord, the British Army retreated to Boston, which was their redoubt, their safe haven. And we're going to look at a map that shows you why. And all the British troops were in Boston, and the American militia followed them back and surrounded them. This should be the map. So these red forces are all British, and these blue forces are American. And in the middle of this, in 1775, is when George Washington came in and helped here, and this was actually a General Roxbury, and they were sieging Boston and Charleston. A siege is basically when you try to hold them out, and there's no supplies coming in or out here, because unless British troops are getting things brought in from the harbor, there's no supplies coming in. So they were maybe trying to starve them out, hold them out, keep them locked in. And then eventually what happened is American forces crept into here. You can see it's called Bunker Hill. There was another hill, Breed's Hill. And the Americans took a position at the top of the hill in an attempt to kind of attack. And British troops crossed this harbor and went to Charleston, and they set it on fire. And that was really enraging for the American troops. And the American troops were on a hill, and which is strategically beneficial. We can kind of see a picture here. We'll go back to that information. But you see these are hills, and if the British military is coming up, and they have to go up the hill, but this militia, American militia, is at the top, and they're shooting down. They don't have to move any to get to the enemy, or if they do, they only have to go downhill. But the British troops have to go uphill, which is strategically disadvantageous. So this happened on June 17, 1775, and the British soldiers did end up pushing the militia back off of Bunker Hill, but they suffered about 1,000 casualties to the colonists, about 400 casualties. And this is the famous line from the top of the hill. Colonel William Prescott said, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." They wanted until the British soldiers got very close to fire. And that's so Britain won the Battle of Bunker Hill, but they definitely took some casualties doing it. And like we said, we have here this fella, general, this time George Washington. He was the first general of the Continental Army, and he took charge. And you should remember his name. It will come back. But I want to go back to this map here. So as long as the British troops are in Boston and Charleston, they're really kind of locked in. They're not going to be able to do much. These straight lines are fortified lines and probably encampments, and they're probably dug out. And so this was a military stronghold. So there's not much that can really be done. George Washington dispatched Benedict Arnold out to Fort Ticonderoga, which is a British fort, and they took some weapons back, and they hauled them back, and so Washington got a whole bunch of cannons, and it took a long time. So the British soldiers must have known it was coming. But in January 1776, the cannons came in, and so now not only were the British soldiers facing American militia, they were facing American militia with heavy cannons. So in March of 76, 1,000 ships came and just evacuated the troops. It's kind of cool. So that was the military response of what's going on right now. The Battle of Bunker Hill, and that again, date June 17, 1775. But the political response, the political beginnings here, is called the Second Continental Congress, and they're the ones who made the Continental Army, of which Washington was the general. So they convened for the first time on May 10th, 1775 in Philadelphia. And a little study question, why were they not in Boston? And if your answer was because Boston was occupied by the British Army, you are very correct. Philadelphia was another burgeoning city. It was big. People knew it. It was Ben Franklin's stomping ground. And so that's where the Second Continental Congress convened. And there were several notable people. We'll look at some of their names and signatures later. But John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, those two fellas ended up being presidents. And then there was this guy named Thomas Paine, who out in the colonies published this pamphlet called Common Sense. And this was distributed all over the colonies. And you have to remember, this is a literate society, not only because of the Puritans, but because, there's no TV to rot people's brains. So, take a minute. You might need to pause the video to read this. And I'm going to read it out loud. Everything that is right or natural pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part. Even the distance at which the Almighty had placed England and America is a strong and natural proof that the authority of one over the other was never the design of heaven. So he's giving reasons why the colonies should not be controlled by England. And this becomes popular all over the colonies. People read this it's a pamphlet. And then the last straw at the Continental Congress, and they wrote, this is grossly simplified, but they drafted, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, which was signed, according to legend, on July 4th, 1776. That's when it's dated. However, it is a matter of much debate as to when all the signatures were actually collected. And the last one might have not been until November, with a guy named Thomas Morton. But this preamble here, this is one of the most famous sentences in English. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this is kind of the foundation of where a lot of our political thinking comes from. And this is a picture. A guy named Thornbull is the artist, and this is supposedly the signing of the Declaration, but it's a little bit misleading. They may not have all been there. And this is the actual Declaration. So this is a copy of it. This is a copy of a copy, to be honest, but for all practical purposes, we can say that this is the Declaration of Independence. And you can see it's written, handwritten. This is Thomas Jefferson. And this is, it's pretty much calligraphy. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And then that next part. So he's saying here, well, if you're going to break off, you should give your reasons. And here begins our reasons. That's the preamble parts of it. And it's a pretty complex document, and you can see that it's just written in a block. justified even. And yeah, there's July 4th, 1776, right there. And let's see. We can see here, not quite there. There it is, the United States of America. Maybe one of the first times that was written. I don't know for sure. But that's big there. And you can see the biggest signature, I'll zoom back out here, is this one, John Hancock. And you might have heard that. Put your John Hancock on it. He was the president of the Second Continental Congress. He was from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he wrote that he was going to sign it so big that King George could read it without his reading glasses, without his spectacles. So, and these are the signatures of everyone who was in the Congress. Lyman Hall was from Georgia. I'll come back to this part in a second. But some famous names here. There's Benjamin Franklin. You know about him. And John Adams, he was the president. Sam Adams was his cousin. Stephen Hopkins, his looks all crazy. He had palsy in his hand, I believe. And therefore his handwriting isn't so great. There's Thornton. He was a late one. He signed it in November. And then there's a big one right there. A name you ought to know. Try to guess the signature, who you think it is. The answer is Thomas Jefferson. He was a president of the United States, as well as the person who wrote the Declaration of Independence. Caesar Rodney was from Delaware. Anyway, it's a fun document to pore over in the somewhat original. And I think that's it. That's all we get to here. Yeah, and there's some classwork if you'd like to do classwork on your own. This page I put together, the Declaration of Independence on Mr. Fowles at Wikispaces, has some pretty cool videos. This one is a dramatic reading. This one is just a reading with the text scrolling. So if you want to listen to it and read it, this is some information. I think it's from the History Channel. Yes, History Channel. This is the full text, typed out, easier to read, and here are some links. So plenty of information here, and that is how America declared its independence, and from here on out, we start talking about the Revolutionary War, and it gets very intense. So, thank you very much.